Do you remember that quote by President Putin? It was like, I meet a president, we agree on something, and then men in black suits come back and discuss something completely separate. Do you remember that quote? I can't remember what he said exactly, but essentially what I think he's implying is that the presidents don't really make the final decision, or at least not in his interactions.
Yes, well, I think he's right on that, and I think this has been going on for some years. But on the other hand, I don't think it's always been the case. But I think it's been the case certainly since Clinton was in office. But the difference between the era when Clinton was in office and now is profound. We were a much stronger country economically, financially, and in terms of social cohesion. We're not that strong now. And that's something else the Russians are aware of. So if you're going to talk to the Russians, you've got to agree to the facts up front. You can't make an agreement with people if your set of facts is completely divorced from theirs. This is very important. If you're going to repeat the narrative that you started with, the Russians are going to go, oh, sit there and close their eyes. And if I were Putin, I'd say, come on, we'll fly you to eastern Ukraine. We'll fly you out there. You can see what's happening. You know, that happened to me after the Kosovo air campaign. I went down there to look at the so-called battle damage assessment, which, by the way, was bullshit. The BDA was just nonsense, pitched by NATO, okay? And I went down there because I said, I need to know for myself. And the British three-star at that point, who later became chief of staff, who was in command, he said, look, I'll give you a Range Rover, and you can drive all over Kosovo, and you can see the battle damage in about 15 to 20 minutes, because we really hadn't inflicted any. 78 days of the air campaign, and what damage had we done to the troops that were in Kosovo? Almost none. So what I'm telling you is I've been down this road before. I know how this works. You create a lie. It becomes a myth. It's fiction, but everybody has to support it. And then he handed me a telegram when I came back from seeing the BDA. And it said, today, the Supreme Commander Europe is going to make an announcement of battle damage assessment. Regardless of what he says, you will support his statement. So he handed it to me and he said, they're going to stand up there and lie. And he was right. That's what we did. Well, we could get away with it. After all, it was little Serbia. You can't just lie your way out of this stuff with the Russians. And that's the problem right now. Everybody has been lying repeatedly for the last 3+ years about what's happening in Ukraine. Not going to be able to do that much longer.
Just on our position, I think we agree on most things on what's happening on the battlefield. Just to make sure my stance is clear, I think Russia has the upper hand. I think what we disagree is how much of an upper hand they have. You're obviously more of an expert than I am, but I definitely don't see things as like ideological simplifications, like Russia's evil, Ukraine's evil, the US is evil. The politics is a lot more complex than that. But I definitely do see, Russia is gaining territory. No one could deny that.
It doesn't matter. Now, the territory is irrelevant. That's what people don't get. I've tried to tell you that before. It's the destruction of Ukrainian military power. It's the destruction of the Ukrainian state because it can't sustain itself and support itself. Has no means of doing so. That's what the Russians have been interested in doing. They've largely accomplished that mission. That's why I've tried to tell you, if the Russians lose 20 or 30 people a day and the retreating Ukrainian forces are losing 1,000 a day, what's the outcome? Well, it's very obvious. Ukraine's lost the war. You keep going back to territory because that's where Zelensky wants everybody to focus. The Russians already control the territory that is largely historically Russian. Not everything, but most of it. But that is not the goal here.
Do you think Trump's strategy of secondary tariffs targeting India, which is something that Biden has not done, could that help Ukraine, Europe, and the US's negotiating position?
No, it's immensely stupid. India is a long-time friend of Russia. They have a great deal in common. They've always supported each other. And the Indians don't give a damn what we threaten. This is back to the other thing that we were talking about earlier. President Trump thinks that we are still the center of the world as the world's economic power and supermarket, if you will. We're not. China is. And if you're pushed into a corner and you're asked, well, do I do business with China or do I do business with the United States? or do I do business with Russia, or do I do business with the United States? People look at the two and say, well, as long as I have access to China's markets, and if you look at BRICS and all the people that are lining up to join it, that's most of the world's population. As long as I have access to those markets, I'm going to join that. So go ahead with your tariffs. Fine. I'll go elsewhere. I think President Trump is finding that out. And if you look at his initial threats, 100% tariff suddenly becomes 50% tariff, suddenly becomes 25% tariff, and it keeps going down because he has no leverage.
So I want to quote a few things that Trump said, and I want to get your thoughts on what he means. Because what I'm trying to understand is what are Trump's cards in the meeting in 2 days? What could he do to end the war? So he said, on one side, he said there's very severe consequences if Putin doesn't end the war. Not sure what that means. Obviously, we've tried sanctions. We've tried, we haven't tariffed other countries. India is the first test of that, but we've tried supporting Ukraine militarily. But he also did walk back on expectations from the meeting. He did say that this is really a feel-out meeting a little bit. And he also did say that in terms of Putin's involvement and intentions, what Putin's intentions are. President Putin invited me to get involved. He wants to get involved. I believe he wants to get it over with. So on one side, he's saying, hey, this is just a meeting to listen to what's going to happen. On the other side, he does seem optimistic that Putin does want results this time around, because previous meetings didn't end up too well. I think they have a call, and then the next day there's a massive Russian attack on Ukraine. Where do you think Trump's mind is at ahead of this meeting? And then what could we expect to see on the weekend?
First of all, I don't expect much to come out of it beyond what I've already described. I just don't. President Trump wants to find a way to end the war. The problem is he feels constrained by his donors and the people that surround him in Washington. President Trump is worried about what will be said about him if he does something they don't like. If he says, look, we've gone as far as we can, I'm getting out, I'm ending this, and I urge the Europeans and President Zelensky to meet with the Russians. I am happy to support whatever outcome they can negotiate, but I think we Americans have other things to focus on right now, and I think this has gone as far as we can go. He's not going to do that. I think that's what he should do. I think that privately is probably what he wants to do. But what you get with Trump is the problem you have with most Western politicians. They all want to be a little bit pregnant, but they don't want to bring the child to term. So what he's telling you is, well, I know that the Russians want to end this. They don't want this war to go on. And I don't want this war to go on. But I don't know what the Russians will do. And I can't see us giving anything up. And I don't think they'll give anything up. In other words, he doesn't want to walk out of the meeting and say, we've talked about this. This is my solution for U.S. interests. Because remember, at the end of the day, in the back of his mind, he knows we are going to reduce our overseas presence. We have to. We can't afford it. In Japan and Korea and China, everybody is just waiting for us to leave. They know we can't stay there much longer. So
yeah,
where do
you mentioned the American debt. I think this is like Admiral Mike Mullen did say it was 2010, it was 15 years ago. He said, when he was asked what is the greatest threat to the U.S. national security, he said the single biggest threat to our national security is our debt. And that was, again, 2010, 15 years ago, where the debt was $13.5 trillion, a lot less what it is today. Today it's $36 trillion debt. Net interest payments back then were 6 times lower than they were today. Back then, Admiral Mike Mullen said it is the greatest threat to national security. So that kind of goes to your point where the U.S. is in a position where it cannot afford that international military presence, especially with what we're seeing in the South China Sea.
And I think you've got to also take into consideration, you go back to the narrative with which you started. And this is the false narrative created in London, primarily, as well as in Langley, that says Russia today is the Soviet Union. Stalin is essentially, Putin is essentially Stalin. That's all nonsense. Russia has no interest in marching into Poland or anywhere else. I mean, if you go all the way back to the beginning of this, and I remember when everyone was saying, oh, Macgregor's a Putin agent, he's this. I said, well, wait a minute. You can't have it both ways. You say on the one hand, the Russian army is incompetent, it's too small, it can't fight. Then you come back and say, but Russia's prepared to conquer Eastern Europe. Now, which of these narratives is accurate? Well, I think we know in the spring of 2022 that Putin, after he sat down with the general staff in May and June, said, the army's too small. It needs to be larger. You know, we have underestimated the enemy. And when he said the enemy, he wasn't so much talking about Ukraine, he was talking about us. I don't think he ever really believed that we were full of so much hatred and hostility to Russia that we would pour hundreds of billions of dollars into trying to destroy the country. I don't think he believed that. And so he had a come to Jesus meeting with the general staff. And they said, it's going to take us this many months to build up. And then you got this Surovikin line, the Surovikin strategic defensive line. The Russians consolidated. And when they consolidated in preparation to build everything up, they went ahead and demonstrated the efficacy of this thing I call the ISR strike complex. Intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platforms at every level, from seabed to space, linked to all of the rocket artillery, missile systems, and conventional artillery systems, to the point where within a few seconds to a few minutes, you could strike any target that threatened you. And once they were inside this defense, our brilliant generals in the United States Army and the British Army all advised the Ukrainians to beat themselves to death against these defenses they couldn't possibly penetrate. And so Ukraine began to lose hundreds of thousands of people. Then finally, when Ukraine was practically bled white, then the Russians began to move again with a new army that they had built almost from scratch, with a manufacturing base that was completely mobilized to outproduce anybody in the world. And they moved. Now they've won it. It's taken them more time than they would have liked, but Putin is also being very sensitive to Russian casualties, and he sees no point in sacrificing Russian life unnecessarily. And so he has moved much more slowly, cautiously, and deliberately with the military than any of his predecessors in the history of that country. We have interpreted everything to suit ourselves. Oh, well, they're weak. The reason they haven't done X is they're weak. The reason they can't do this is they're weak. They don't have this. They don't have that. It's all nonsense. And I guess, based upon what I'm hearing from so many people in Washington, that until the Russians are in Kiev and probably sitting on the docks in Odessa, no one is going to believe that Russia has won, which I think is very unfortunate for Ukraine, because it doesn't have to be that way.
What about Europe's position in all this? So we've seen the US cut their aid. Now Europe is buying weapons from the US to supply Ukraine. They're trying to step up. They met with Zelensky, I think it was yesterday. They've increased defense spending as well since Trump has become president. How do you see Europe shift throughout all this? And how much support could they still offer Ukraine? And how do you see Europe post the Ukraine war?
Well, I saw some information this morning, and I can't verify all of it, but it suggests that the Europeans now, for the first time since this war in Ukraine began, are actually spending more money on equipment and ammunition and so forth for Ukraine than we are, which I think is interesting. I think we have to understand that just as the American people feel divorced and alienated from their government for a whole range of reasons, the situation in Europe, Western Europe in particular, is much worse. I think what the governments say, what the ruling political classes argue for, and what the populations that live in France and Great Britain, Germany, probably Scandinavia, though I'm not as confident that that's true, because the Scandinavians have always had the unfortunate position to be on the rim of everything, but at the same time, it's been a great benefit to them. The problem is that it encourages delusional thinking, much as we have in the United States. But the vast majority of Europeans that I'm dealing with, and the polling data that I'm looking at from Poland, from the Polish border all the way to France, no one is interested in going to war with Russia. Nobody. So what have we got? We've got an elite that wants to stay in power. And they have been beating the drum for war and insisting that Russia is this dangerous force that is imminent in terms of its ability to attack and overrun Europe. I think that mantra is wearing out. I think people in Europe and these European states are fed up and frustrated. And remember, just as we have problems here at home that we absolutely must address, I would argue the situation inside Great Britain and France and Germany, Italy, elsewhere, is actually more acute, more serious. So the bottom line is, I think these governments are going to turn over.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time. But first, your figures are correct, what you saw online. I just checked it now. As of June, I think it's as of June, as of spring this year, Europe spending is outpacing US spending in support of Ukraine. But in terms of the situation in Western Europe, yes, they do face a lot of the same problems as the US, and in some cases it is more acute, especially when it comes to free speech and the kind of populist movement in some countries. I've met many of those leaders earlier this year. So how long do you think Europe could still support Ukraine, and to what extent? And how much strength, military strength, does Europe have with that increased spending relative to Russia's wartime economy?
Well, remember that spending doesn't equal military capability. And what they're producing is not necessarily for themselves at this stage, but to ship to Ukraine. I think Europe is extremely weak. I don't think they have the military power at their disposal to suppress an internal revolt or rebellion if it comes up. And I think that's in the offing, and people are worried about it. I don't know how many times I've had friends in Britain call me and tell me that the British Army is woefully undermanned to deal with what they think is an inevitable civil war. So I don't think any of this is going to translate into the kind of military power that we normally associate with NATO, which is military power designed to protect NATO from an external enemy. I think that's at an all-time low. So this doesn't present any real threat to Russia. In fact, whatever Europe sends over is more of an irritant than anything else, and it's going to be destroyed in any case because there are very few people to man anything. I mean, the manpower drain in Ukraine is beyond belief. They're trying to field battalions of old men and boys. So I don't think the Russians are particularly worried about it. You know, NATO is think of NATO as a terminal patient. In other words, the patient's close to death. It's lying on the slab. It's on life support. And the solution to NATO's problems is to give it a haircut and a shave. But the patient's dying. It needs a heart transplant. It needs organ transplants in many other areas. It can't be reduced in age. It's too old. It probably can't survive the operation. So the real question is, how long do we keep it on life support? That's the real question.
Why would you say that? Why would you say that about NATO?
I've been in it for years. I was there for at least half of my military career, and it was singularly unimpressive when I was in it. You're talking about an alliance that consists of a herd of cats. You've got, what, 32 members now? When I was there were 19. And then when I left, we were up to, I think, 23 or 24. Getting the so-called NATO allies to move in any given direction was practically an insurmountable obstacle. All of the Europeans, generally speaking, would listen to us because they saw the NATO alliance as an avenue of communication and potentially money that ran back to Washington. But in terms of the ability to fight, forget it. It had none, and it has even less now. And now it's very obvious that the way NATO forces are organized, trained, and equipped, there's no chance for success on the battlefield that the Russians have created. That battle space would eat them alive. I think as people know this, that's why the statement by this man Donahue about rapidly overrunning Kaliningrad is just incredibly stupid. First of all, we can't do that. And if we were to do a thing like that, we'd be at war instantly overnight with Russia, since the Russians have held that for 80 years and they consider it sovereign national territory. I think we are substituting bombast, substituting arrogance for reality, for facts, for capability. It's a bad move.
How much credit do you give? I understand your stance, Colonel, but how much credit can you give Ukraine and the Western support for being able to sustain this war this long, for being able to push Russia out of all that territory around Kiev early in 2022 in northern Ukraine, and to be able to hold the line for so long? I understand they're losing. Most would agree that's the case, both militarily but also on the ground in terms of territory. But credit, do you believe credit is due for how hard Ukraine has fought and the military capabilities? I've spoken to a lot of people in Ukraine that invest in military tech there, and they're saying that military capabilities in Ukraine outpace many European countries, and Ukraine could become one of the big military players in Europe post-war if the peace agreement allows for that to happen?
Well, you can't have a peace agreement that allows for that to happen. So you can forget that right off the bat. I, as a Russian, would never allow a thing like that to occur any more than I would allow an army or an armed force to emerge in Mexico that is heavily trained and equipped by Russians and Chinese to attack the United States. Forget it. It's not going to happen. So what about giving credit? Well, first of all, I grew up with Ukrainians, and I know them very well. You're talking about some of the toughest human beings on the planet. These are very tough people and incredibly stubborn. They will fight you until there's nothing left, and that's what's happened. Their courage, their character, their strength has been misused in service to a United States strategy designed to ruin Russia. That's the great tragedy. They haven't been fighting for themselves, and most of the territory they're fighting for was never Ukrainian to begin with. This all go back over the last 500 years. It's ridiculous, the lines that are drawn. Crimea was Mongol, Turkic. In other words, it was part of the Crimean Khanate, which was subservient to the Turkish Sultan at the end, and then it became Russian, and it remained Russian after that. It was never Ukrainian. People say, well, the map says, well, the map was drawn by Khrushchev and some of his cronies from the Communist Party of Ukraine in the middle of a drunken stupor, and he wanted to reward his buddies for doing what he wanted. It had nothing to do with reality on the ground. When you hold a conference and you're trying to sort these things out, the first thing you've got to do is familiarize with the facts. And the facts in Ukraine do not begin last week. They don't begin 10 years ago. They don't begin 50 years ago or 80 years ago. You have to understand the region. The Russians know this, and so do the Ukrainians. But the Ukrainians have fought tenaciously and courageously. That's not open for debate. The Russians will say that immediately without hesitation. No one is here to deride the strength and the courage of Ukrainian people. That's nonsense. But it was never a reasonable mission. They could never accomplish it. All you had to do is look at the two states side by side, look at the resources in each one, and understand that Ukraine has never been in its history an independent sovereign state. Now, people will go back to the Cossack Sich that existed back in the 1600s, and they'll point to that as a nascent Ukrainian state. Okay, fine. But there is no modern Ukrainian national state with institutions that have roots in centuries. The Russian institutions that are leading this country have survived for centuries. They have a long history, particularly in terms of military power and military culture. All of that was absent in Ukraine. Even the Ukrainian officers like Sersky and others at the top were all trained and educated in what were effectively Soviet Russian institutions. Now, under the circumstances, given what was available to them, they've done pretty well. I think everybody agrees with that. But you also have to understand something else. Putin took a long time to come to terms with certain realities. He believed in his heart of hearts that Ukrainians and Russians were Slavic Orthodox Christian brothers. He believed that. Took him a long time to figure out, no, that's not true. He has never wanted to kill large numbers of Ukrainians. In his view, there are too few Slavs as it is in Eastern Europe. We need more Slavs in his view, not less. So he didn't want to kill large numbers of Ukrainians. But over time, he had to come to terms with reality that he was dealing not just with Ukrainians, but with the United States and its allies. They were going to push these people into the jaws of death ad nauseum until Russia was exhausted or destroyed. And at that point, everything changed. And you get the current Russian military establishment. But even now, even though the bridges are there over the Dnieper River, the Russian military has been told to exercise restraint. He has never wanted a war with the United States or NATO. And he has always convinced himself that if he pushed too far, too fast, he would get that war. Now, that may or may not be true, but I think now he's begun to change his mind. Not that he's ready for a war with us, but that he absolutely has to end this dramatically on terms that are unambiguous. So there's no more discussion along the lines that you and I are having right now. No one shows up at the table and pretends the Ukrainians are winning anything anywhere, that it's over. So I think that's where he's headed. And that's why I said at the beginning, you've got to come to terms with facts that both sides can accept. And if we're not going to accept the facts on the ground, and we're not going to accept the facts that are historic regarding the history of this region and the people that live in it, then I don't see how you get an agreement of any kind.
So what does Ukraine, Europe, NATO, the US need to do today for the war to end? Not a temporary ceasefire.
President Trump needs to announce that we are ending our involvement in this war against Russia.
But then wouldn't Russia's incentive to continue fighting and continue taking territory?
I think the Russians are not interested in continuing to take territory. This is my bottom line. They've got all the territory they need right now. And I think that if we did that and we said, we're out, we're not going to support this any longer, we're getting completely out, and then demonstrated it by starting to remove the people who are there, I think the Russians would then say, fine, we're willing to talk to European leaders and we'll talk to Kiev and come to some sort of territorial arrangement on the ground. But the problem that you've got is European leadership in London, Paris, Berlin have said, no, the only way this war can end is if Russia gets on its knees, begs for forgiveness, and runs away. Well, that's not going to happen. It's back to what are the facts on the ground? What are the facts historically? And believe me, the British don't care about historical facts in the region. They're as committed to ruining and harming Russia as the fools in Washington. So they don't give a damn about Ukraine. The Germans, they're just doing what the rest of their globalist buddies want them to do. But if you got rid of the Berlin government and brought in somebody that was a national sovereign German government for a change, they would look at this and say, this is insane. And they would be interested in ending it and sit down with the Russians, as all of these people in Europe need to do. You need a conference, and we can support this, but we can't lead it. You need a conference with everybody who borders Ukraine. So who borders Ukraine right now? I guess you could argue Lithuania, a small sliver, but I think it's primarily Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Moldova, and Romania. We just saw a popularly elected government in Romania removed from power by the courts because the popularly elected leadership in Romania said we want to end the war. What more evidence do you want for what's happening?
He also threatened to stop the development of the NATO base in Romania as well.
Yes.
It's a pretty crazy story there.
Well, it's not crazy. They don't need it. It never needed to be there to begin with. You know what the rationale for that base was initially? It was to protect Romania and the other countries in Eastern Europe from Iran. And so Iran...
Oh, yes, I remember the rationale. Yes, of course.
Yeah, it was going to launch ballistic missiles. It's absurd. It made no sense at all. And when I was still on active duty and I was basically laughed at in a meeting, and I, in retrospect, I could understand why the people laughed, but I, of course, was thinking very differently. I said, well, if the Russians are really worried about this base, which we say is entirely about air and missile defense, why not invite a delegation of Russian officers to come there and see what we're doing, and they'll understand this is just about air and missile defense. Of course, I was a fool. It wasn't, was it? That's the problem.
Colonel, last question is, so how would this war end from a territorial perspective? Actually, from just a political perspective as well. So you'd say Donbass under Russian control. I think 80% of it is under Russian control today, 70, 80%. Crimea, I think it's unquestionable now this will remain under Russian control. There's two more regions left, which are Kherson and Zaporizhia. Both are majority under Russian control. Do you think that the current line, the battle lines, will just be drawn and this will be the new Russian territory over time, will be annexed from Ukraine? Is that how the war will end territorially? And from a political perspective, what happens to Ukraine? Do you think Ukraine, is there any chance for the security of Ukraine, they'll be able to join NATO? And could we see a European peacekeeping force in Ukraine as an alternative if Ukraine cannot join NATO?
First of all, I don't see any evidence for the peacekeeping force from Europe and Ukraine because that's a red line for the Russians. You put in NATO forces of any kind into Western Ukraine, Russia declares war and moves against you. So I don't see that happening. Secondly, if it were only about the line that you described, in other words, if you could ensure that future governments in Ukraine were neutral and behaved like the Austrian governments have, then I think the Russians could consider that and potentially accept it. But see, this is the problem, and this is where we started this conversation. if the Russians are willing to accept an Austrian solution, which I think is the best solution, by the way, for Europe. When I was at SHAPE in NATO, privately, we said the best mission for Ukraine is to stay neutral, because it puts hundreds of miles between the Russian military and NATO. In other words, that's a win. If Russian troops are sitting east of the Dnieper, what's bad about that? That's a good thing. So let's keep NATO, or let's keep Ukraine neutral. Obviously, I was wrong, and so were the European officers that agreed with me at the time. Now we've got a different situation. How do you get the Russians to reach the point where they understand, or believe, frankly, that the countries I just described, as well as the United States in the background, will provide for a truly neutral Ukraine? That I'm not sure that that's in the offing right now. I mean, we're already meddling in Moldova. We've already meddled there in terms of influencing the election of that president. The CIA and MI6 are very busy in all these places, trying to ensure the governments remain aligned with what London and Washington want. That's why the best way to end this, in my judgment, is for us to say, that's it. We're out. We've had it. We have more important issues. We think this war is over. We don't want anybody to die pointlessly in it any longer. And we will be happy to support a conference between Moscow and the countries that border Ukraine to come to an effective solution. But we can't be part of this any longer. I think that would be a dramatic step in the direction of ending this and ending the tensions, because I still think we have a very important strategic interest in normalizing relations with Russia. Is that going to happen? Based upon what we've seen thus far from Donald Trump, what can we say? What has he changed in terms of foreign policy and defense policy since he took office? Nothing. It's the Biden route. I tell people, what we did after President Trump was inaugurated is we're on the same highway, headed in the same direction. We just changed lanes. That's the problem.
That's a somber way to end it. But Colonel, as always, really appreciate your time. Thank you, and I'm sure we'll speak again.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I'm sorry I got a little exercise, but I'm tired of dealing with some of these falsehoods that are just so widespread, and they're destructive because they're not true. And unless we can accept the facts, nothing will change.